Okay, good morning everyone. It is now 9:30 and so I resume the hearing. Could I ask the Council to give us its housekeeping rules, please?
Thank you. Most people are here today, have been here before, but I'll just go through the issues as normal. First of all, please sign in at the desk at the front if you haven't already done so, just in the break. Likewise, in terms of fire alarms, I'm not expecting fire alarms to go off today. If it does, it is a genuine emergency. If that's the case, please exit the building through the front doors and congregate on the corner of Gillygate and Claremont Terrace, just by the traffic lights. Only use the main access doors at the front to come in out of the building. Don't use any side doors at this stage, please. There are other users in the building today, in other rooms for various classes. So there are other people around. If you do see people that you don't think should be here, please alert a member of the staff for security. Toilets are just through the corridor on the other side, just behind where Carol's standing. Water obviously on the tables, and for people in the public gallery, there's water on tables at the front as well. In terms of lunchtime break, there's plenty of cafes and restaurants in Gillygate if you can to get a sandwich or a coffee. Please ensure your mobiles are turned to silent today. As you're aware, we are recording the session and it's being filmed. If you do have an issue with this, please speak to Carol as soon as possible and she can relocate you to a table where the camera won't be pointing at you. In terms of speaking, obviously if you want to speak, turn your name card on its end, get the attention of the inspectors and they will indicate you can speak. Press the red button on your microphone to speak, and once you finish speaking, turn it off with the button again. Wi-Fi here is very good. If you want to log in as Citadel guest, and the password, it's all one word, it's General Booth 1883, and it's capital G and capital B. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I've been told that someone has been taking photographs during the event and posting them on social media. We would rather that you didn't do that, please, without the consent of those involved. For the very little that it's worth, you're more than welcome to use my image. We do have a number of different faces around the table today, so I think it's worth doing brief introductions. And so if we can, as usual, start with the Council, please.
I'm only going to be here for opening remarks, but David Elvin QC, with Mr. Scott Line as QC, and Matt Henderson, who's our junior for the Council. Thank you.
Richard Wood, Consultant representing City of York Council.
Hannah Ortega, Consultant representing City of York Council.
Mark Johnson, John Mowat, representing Taylor Wimpey, Redrow and KCS.
Good morning everyone, Stuart Natkus of Barton Wilmore on behalf of Boughton David Wilson Homes.
Good morning, Tom Robinson from JLL, representing NHS Property Services.
Mark Lane from DPP, representing various parties.
Morning everyone, Paul Butler here for TW Fields.
George Wright, Planning Consultant.
Jennifer Hubbard, Planning Consultant representing Esquik Park Estate and the Grimston Bar Development Group.
Emma Winter from Carter Jonas representing L&Q Estates.
Michael Corsier, Fulford Parish Council.
Matthew Good, Pegasus Group on behalf of Lovell Developments.
Tim Collard, Avison Young on behalf of the DIO.
Dave Merritt, representing York Labour Party and York and District Trades Union Council.
Eamon Keogh, O'Neill Associates, representing Galtrays Garden Village Development Company.
Michael Hargreaves for York Travellers Trust.
Alistair Willis, Lichfields, on behalf of Bellway.
I'm Chris Wedgwood, just representing myself.
Morning, it's Chris Lee from Gladman.
Tim Waring from Quad, representing Langwith Development Partnership.
Mary Cook, good morning, from Town Legal, representing LDP.
Good morning, sirs. Paul Tucker, Queen's Counsel, instructed by O'Neill Associates, representing the University of York, York St John's University, St Peter's School, York, and Askham Bryan Agricultural College.
Janet O'Neill, O'Neill Associates, planning consultants for the same clients.
Good morning, sir. Thorfinn Caithness from Edwardson Associates in Driffield, representing two clients, Mr Kelly and Messrs Nicholson. Thank you.
Sarah Worthington from Erdon Planning, representing Mr Harrison, a local resident.
Thank you for that. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. So as with previous sessions, we are going to struggle, I think, seeing people's name plates. So if we do get your name wrong, then please forgive us. So just a few words really about the way that I'm going to work today. So in essence, it's to look at the Council's work in relation to the defining the green belt boundaries, and we have the matter of only 3 questions to cover, so a simple task on the face of it. What I'm going to do is take all 3 issues together because there doesn't seem much sense, frankly, in trying to divide it up. First of all, I'm going to look to the Council to walk us through their work, frankly, to make sure that we understand it and it's completely clear in our minds. It may or may not assist others as well. And during that part of the session, I'm not going to take any comments or any other points from anyone else until we've completed that walkthrough. I should say, well, a couple of things actually. We have set out our views already on some of the issues that are involved today, and we won't be debating those aspects, so please don't try. We're not reopening those points. Now, the Council's work, part of the Council's work at least, relies on other things such as the need for housing, employment, for accommodation for gypsies and travellers, and schools and education establishments, lots of other things. In terms of the question of the need itself, that is not for today either. So please don't try and pull us in that direction. I'd be grateful. Now, I think just before we do move on that Mr Elvin wanted to say a few words.
Yeah, it's just in relation to matter 5 from yesterday. I forgot to raise this at the end of the day. As you know, we put in revised supply and windfall documents, CYC 76 and 77, and Mr Olsbury for DIO is coming back with his comments within days, he said. I meant to ask, others have mentioned they may want to comment on the latest information, and I wondered if we could make sure that we get that by the middle of next week. What we're planning to do is to respond to that and to provide the details of each site included within the schedule and updating some of the information, for example, years 6 and 7 for the extant permissions that we said we could look at, which will be needed in the connection with phase 3. And we were aiming to do this by about the 10th of June to allow time for MIQs and responses, hearing statements for phase 3. So I wonder if we might have some certainty about receiving any further reps by the middle of next week so we can deal with that.
I think that seems fair. And from our perspective as well, it's going to be very helpful to have all of that before we move on to phase 3.
Yes. Well, the thing is, if there are specific comments, and I know Mr Olsbury is going to do it for DIO on some of the sites, we can deal with those. What we have in mind is a pro forma sheet for each of the proposed allocations, and that can take in the comments that we receive and respond to them or agree with them or whatever it is we're going to do, and provide our position on that, which I think would be more helpful for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think perhaps the best way of doing that might be to put something on the examination webpage, perhaps.
Yes, I was hoping you'd say that. Can I also raise one matter which may be...
What would be very helpful to me would be if the council could just draft something and notes
I'll
to
do
go
that.
on the...
Yes, I'm going into the back room to look at infrastructure for next week, but I'll draft something up and send it to Carol. The other thing may be less welcome, which is just to make a gentle request of you, which is you've indicated that you're likely to give an indication as to whether you're satisfied that the plan can continue to go forward in due course. We wondered, and I say this with some trepidation, whether you would be in a position to give us your views on the numbers. That is to say, the economics number and the housing requirement number. And I appreciate it has to turn on your commitments and whether you feel you can do it at this stage. But it would assist us considerably knowing how to take matters forward with phases 3 and 4 if we could have an idea, well, a preliminary view with reasons to follow in your report on those matters.
Yes, thanks for asking that. It might, in practical terms, be quite difficult anyway, in terms of our commitments. We've got quite a bit to think about, and we're here next week as well. I have to say, in general terms, I'm pretty reluctant to issue interim findings. I know I already have once in this examination. I think that might be the first time in my career, actually. We'll give it some thought. We will let you know whether we're going to be able to do that or not. But whatever the outcome of that, if I can put it this way, we wouldn't proceed to phase 3 if we didn't think that there was a reasonable chance of the plan being found sound at the end of the process on the basis of what we'd heard already.
No, and I understood that that's what you'd said. The only reason I raise it is because of the statement I made the other day, which is that if we're going to have to revisit some of the allocations, the sooner we can do that, the better. But I'm not going to say any more. I've just made the point and I understand your position. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Arvin. Right, so as I've promised then, if I can look to the council, please, to take us through what I'd like really is a reasonably detailed walk through the topic paper addendum. As I say, with the aim in mind really of making sure that we understand it properly and in the necessary detail as well. So I don't know how exactly you want to do that, Mr. Linus.
Sir, what I propose to do is make a very short introduction, set the scene. Then I'll take Mr. Wood through the main questions, particularly those at question 7.1. I know that you want to deal with them comprehensively, but 7.1 sets out a series of questions that are probably a useful structure to begin with. And then it may be useful if we can pick up just some general themes that have arisen through the representations and deal with those as part of the introduction. So 3 elements, if that's acceptable to you, sir.
No, yes, that sounds precisely like the sort of thing I had in mind. So just to remind everyone, I won't be taking any comments or questions from around the table until we've sort of finished this sequence, if you like, although I think that Mr. Griffiths and I might like to ask questions as you go along.
Very well, thank you, sir. Sir, if we go back to the letter that you and your colleague wrote in June 2020, EX-INS 15, you obviously identified a number of shortcomings in the methodology which had been adopted by the Council in its earlier TP1 addendum. And what the Council has sought to do in its latest work, EXCYC 59, I'll just call it the addendum from now on, is to transparently acknowledge those concerns And what we've done within that document, is Table 5 from page 103 on, is to essentially summarise what we understood those concerns to be and what we've done. And if I can just indicate very broadly what those things were. The first concern was that aspects of the spatial shapers, which have been debated already at the inquiry, were not relevant to the assessment of Greenbelt purposes. That was the one concern that you identified. The second one was confusion caused by the recognition that there may be areas important to the character and setting of York beyond those shown in figure 7 of the earlier addendum. Thirdly, there was a query over the relevance of access to services when considering Greenbelt Purpose 1 on assisting in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. Fourthly, there was the treatment of concerns relating to the coalescence of settlements smaller than towns as part of Greenbelt Purpose 2. Fifthly, there was the treatment of natural features, including nature conservation sites, as correlative of areas that needed to remain permanently open in relation to Greenbelt Purpose 3. And sixthly, there was concern that detailed local assessment criteria didn't have a clear and unequivocal connection to Greenbelt purposes. Now, the new work that is now before the examination revises the methodology in the following summary ways. First of all, we have sought to ensure that boundary setting is more clearly referable to Greenbelt purposes. Secondly, we sought to ensure that the overall approach to evidence relating to the historic character of York, including the use of heritage impact appraisals, is clarified. Thirdly, we've sought to ensure that the erroneous conflation of access to services and facilities with Greenbelt Purpose 1 is avoided. Fourthly, we've proceeded on the basis that Purpose 2 is not engaged for the reasons that were mentioned in your letter. Fifthly, we've clarified how the identification of land with particular natural features does not determine that it needs to be kept open necessarily. And sixthly, we've clarified how local assessment criteria relate generally to Greenbelt purposes, in particular through the posing of questions that relate to respective purposes. Now, we have sought to effectively clarify the approach which concerned you, sir, redirecting the approach to the relevant evidence base. This, we emphasise, contrary to the allegations that are put forward by some, is not simply a retrofitting exercise. The annexes to the report, 2 for the outer boundary, 3 for the inner boundary, 4 for other settlements, and 5 for freestanding settlements, we say diligently justify the boundaries through the application of the revised methodology. We acknowledge that there are some proposed modifications to the boundary that are summarised in Annex 6 to the addendum. That illustrates how the Council has revisited its boundary recommendations where it's thought appropriate, applying the revised methodology. But fundamentally, we've produced work that hasn't yielded significantly different outcomes across the boundary setting exercise considered as a whole. Finally, by way of introduction, we endorse what you have said, sir, that obviously today there are detailed matters relating to boundary setting which need to be considered, but you have already reached judgments on other aspects that were debated extensively at Phase 1 relating to the general approach taken by the Council and its conformity with regional spatial strategy. We've treated those matters as resolved and taken those on board in scoping the work that's been done. And we also anticipate that issues relating to need have already been addressed in other stages of the examination, do not need to be recorded or repeated again here.
Just to correct you, they already have been or will be in relation to some.
Yes, understood, sir. Yes, particularly in relation to gypsies and so on, understand the point. Beyond that general introduction, what I will ask Mr. Wood to do is take you through the methodology that is now in front of the examination. And he'll do that by taking your questions, sir, and asking him to summarise the position in respect of each one. So first of all, if I can just ask Mr. Wood to go through the detail of how the boundaries have been arrived at by reference to the methodology that's now contained in the addendum, and I'll pick up other questions as we go through.
Okay, thank you, Richard Wood, for the Council. I'm going to just really explain the different stages of the methodology and set that out and try and give an overview and some references to the document. Clearly, there's the document as a whole, but I appreciate we're looking for a more concise summary today. What hopefully does help, not necessarily now, is that in the Council's statement for this session, we have set out a flow diagram setting out the 4 stages of the methodology, which I'm about to talk through, and there are also 5 paragraphs sitting under that diagram that also aim to give a concise summary of the methodology, so that hopefully, as well as what I run through now, that piece of information is also helpful to you in understanding the methodology and for others around the table. So what we've got with the addendum, and to try and, I guess, explain it in as simple terms as possible, there are 4 stages to the methodology, and they're reflected in the different sections. So if we start with stage 1, what the methodology seeks to do is to really set the context, and in doing that, establish some strategic principles, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the early sections of the addendum, of that methodology, consider really what are the key things that this methodology needs to take into account. So it sets out the RSS policies, the MPPF, the implications of the MPPF, looks at the Greenbelt appraisal and looks particularly more detail at the Greenbelt appraisal and the heritage topic paper, mindful of the discussion that was had on those issues before, and really sort of says, well, what are the implications of all these different documents for the next stage, for the actual boundary setting exercise. And what we have then set out, really the sort of first key thing to highlight, I think, is that at page 37 on the addendum, and then running on to subsequent pages, there are a series of strategic principles set out. Now, what they hope to do is really or what they do, is they take a lot of, I guess, sort of different and quite a large sort of extent of different policy parameters and policy issues, and really try and distill them down to what are the key principles and really fundamental factors that we need to take into account in boundary setting. So I'm not going to run through them all, but they are set out there. And really what they're looking at is, well, things like what are the key features, what does the general extent of the Greenbelt set out in RSS tell us? What do RSS policies tell us? What do the sort of different evidence-based documents, what are the really key things we need to be thinking about going forward? So as I say, they're set out from paragraph 5.4 onwards.
Just perhaps if we can take the strategic principles, please, Mr. Wood. They are set out, as you say, on page 37 of the topic paper. Are you able to identify the principles in summary form, just to explain to the inspectors how this is scoping exercise that you've mentioned has been followed, please?
Sorry, just say.
Yes, could you take the inspectors through the strategic principles?
Yes, that's fine. I followed that bit then. The next bit I wasn't quite clear if I was doing the right thing. Thank you very much. So we've got the principles set out, SP1 through to SP13 on the following page. So we've got the principles. I won't run through everyone in detail, but the first one's in terms of issues such as the fact that what's the primary purpose of the Greenbelt? What are we looking to achieve, particularly drawing on RSS policies, looking at the situation that we have other authorities that's been set out in the earlier chapters, that some sections of the methodology, that some areas of the Greenbelt have already been defined in neighbouring authority areas. That's reflected under the second principle. We then start to see other aspects of the RSS, SP3, in terms of reflecting the the general extent and the description of the York Green Belt in the RSS policies, and really sort of drawing on analysis work in terms of where the sort of starting point should be in terms of the sort of key task in terms of setting the detailed inner and outer boundaries of the Green Belt. Picking up in terms of national policy, in terms of understanding what we need to do, in terms of looking at villages and whether they're included within the Green Belt. And then really we try and explore in more detail through SP6 and SP7 in particular the implications of the heritage topic paper and being much more specific as to how the principal characteristics and the work that was undertaken in 2014 to provide a broader based understanding of the special qualities, character and setting of the city. What does that mean for the exercise? What are the key things are that we need to take from that? So that's then drawn out in more detail in SP7, and this is a sort of a more, I guess, key considerations, particularly under Purpose 4, and drawing out the 3 principal characteristics from the heritage topic paper that were felt to be relevant and applicable to openness and Greenbelt purposes. Not to go into too much detail at this point, but there are 6 characteristics in the heritage topic paper. I know some comments have been made about, well, why these 3 and what work was done to do that. Appendix 2 of the addendum does set out an assessment where the different characteristics were looked at. So this principle draws on the topic paper as a whole and also that assessment looking at those different characteristics. We then draw on further work in terms of looking at the issues around villages and their identity and the issues around of sprawl. Looking at drawing in under 9 the analysis that's been done in terms of understanding, well, what is the extent of built-up areas in terms of providing a starting point and drawing on the analysis that was undertaken for that. Then at 10, we've got the link across in terms of alignment with the spatial strategy of the plan and overall approach of the plan in terms of considering the issues and implications around where development needs to be met, and then really drawing through other sort of key principles from the MPPF in terms of wanting to reduce the harm to the purposes of Greenbelt and also ensuring that the boundaries would endure beyond the plan period, and also drawing out sort of key aspects under SP13 around the detail of when permanent boundaries are looked at and what the sort of key principles are. So that's the 13 points there, which is sort of, again, I say, repeating the points, sort of trying to do a distillation of all of these different key influences on the methodology and for the subsequent stages.
Would I be right in thinking that the views that we have already set out have influenced the way in which you have gone about things in relation to some of these strategic principles? The obvious one, I suppose, is SP3 and the question of the 6 miles from York city centre.
Yes, we've, I guess as a whole, we've, in terms of the identification of the strategic principles, just stepping back from those, there was the concerns you raised about, I guess, the lack of, there was some strategic considerations set out previously and local assessment criteria, and we really reflected on that clearly that wasn't getting across, that some things are broader considerations, how we've taken those into account, and then the more detailed ones. So I guess what we've really looked to do through these strategic principles is be much clearer about these broader strategic considerations. What are they and what do they mean for the methodology? And then to pick up on your detailed points and the advice that you've already given, such as SP3.
So yes, SP3 is the obvious example in the list, but generally you're right. We've taken on board and accepted the findings in your letter. SP1 is another example where I think it's broadly accepted that the primary purpose of the York Green Belt is to safeguard the special character and setting of the historic city, and that takes on a view that was reached in your letter. So in broad terms, sir, yes is the answer to your question. If that's stage 1, Mr. Wood, can we deal with stage 2 then, please?
Yes, so stage 2 of the methodology, in its simplest terms, is a scoping exercise. So we take the strategic principles from section 5 and we really consider the question, well, what are the boundaries which need to be set? So we look at the remaining sections of the outer boundary, so we can see, again, without going into sort of page by page in the methodology, but at section 6 of the methodology, it considers the situation in all the relevant neighbouring, bordering local authorities and sets out the situation with the outer boundary. So that's worked through. That's probably fairly familiar material from the previous addendum, but it's sort of in its right place here. Look then at the scope of the main urban area of York in terms of really setting the context for the inner boundary definition, and then consider other urban areas including villages. So really trying to sort of identify where do we need to set boundaries and what are the sort of lengths and areas that we need to do in undertaking that exercise. So that's the essence of the scoping part of the methodology at section 6.
As far as stage 3 is concerned, I think you've identified that as addressing the need to promote sustainable patterns of development. Can you explain that next, please?
Yeah, there is that emphasis in terms of promoting sustainable patterns of development, and there's a key link across here in terms of some of the key principles and policies set out in the MPPF. So what we consider here is the need to promote sustainable patterns of development, to consider the sort of option of and the priority in the MPPF in terms of looking at channeling development towards the urban areas and the extent to which that can be undertaken through the wider plan process, so drawing in wider evidence from the plan making process and its evidence base, considers within doing that the development needs, and also then considers the supply and shortfall issues, so really understanding, well, can the urban area accommodate that development need, or do we need to look elsewhere, sort of either beyond or within the general extent of the Greenbelt. So the section 7 as well.
Apologies, just to clarify there, when you say shortfall, is that a reference to there not being, you say, sufficient land in the urban areas?
So I'm probably using shortfall in a different context here, but yes, so I'm from a Greenbelt methodology point of view, how much can we accommodate within the urban area, and then against need, but what's, perhaps I should say the difference, or what we cannot accommodate, where does that get located?
Thank you.
Okay. So I was just going to say we consider the locations beyond the Greenbelt boundary and the work that the Council undertook linked to the duty to cooperate in terms of liaising with neighbouring authorities and understanding whether York's need could be met within, beyond, so not within, beyond the general extent of the Greenbelt in neighbouring authorities areas, and the conclusions that were drawn from that exercise, that would not be an approach, and really then sort of draws overall conclusions around really trying to get the consistency between the local plan strategy and the Greenbelt approach, and just explaining how those come together.
Thank you. And if we move on to stage 4, the methodology for setting the detailed boundaries, can you run through that, please, to help the inspectors? I think it's set out at section 8 of the addendum, starting on page 68 of that document.
Yes, I'll run through that. I guess, again, just trying to sort of step back from this. I think this is a section where a lot of the points that Mr. Linus ran through at the beginning in terms of the concerns that you'd expressed previously about the methodology, and particularly this issue that fundamentally in the MPPF it's about Greenbelt purposes. That I appreciate there are other aspects, but we needed to be very clear on how land within the Greenbelt does meet Greenbelt purposes. So that's very much a driving point, driving sort of driving issue for this section of the methodology. And also being clearer again about this issue you'd raised about we're just not clear on what are local assessment criteria and what are strategic considerations. So what we've looked to do is just in the introduction to this section, just highlight some of the key evidence-based work and then look at sort of each of the three purposes that have been looked at. But fundamentally, I think probably the tables that are set out in the document for the methodology for each criterion is probably the best way of really trying to convey how this has been done. So there's a sort of an introduction to each of the purposes and highlighting sort of key evidence-based sources and key issues in the run-up to the table. And then we, again, in terms of trying to make things as clear and as simple as possible, for each of the five criterion, there's three that are set out for purpose 4. There's a key question set out, just almost a one-line. What's the headline? What are we trying to achieve under this criterion? We then draw in the strategic principles. How does this criterion, how does this issue, for example, compactness is the first criterion we looked at. How is this relevant in terms of the strategic principles that we've previously identified in the methodology? And then we work that through to detailed assessment questions, which was really particularly geared out for somebody doing a site visit or an appraisal or looking at this in effect on the ground or in a more detailed manner or doing desktop work. What are the sort of detailed questions that we're actually trying to address? And again, I guess trying to keep those sort of two as tight as possible in terms of the sort of number of questions.
Sorry, Mr. Wood, to just interrupt you there. In terms of looking at, say, criterion 1 under purpose 4, page 72, refers to compactness, and the other criteria, which I'm sure you'll come on to, landmark monuments, landscape and setting and so on. Can you just confirm that where those have come from?
Yeah, I had that point in my head, but it hadn't quite come out yet. So yes, they are the, as touched on earlier from the scoping principles, they are the 3 principal characteristics. They are 3 of the 6 principal characteristics from the heritage topic paper that have been assessed and drawn through as being the key relevant characteristics relevant to purpose 4 for this methodology. So the first 3 criteria reflect those 3 principal characteristics.
Thank you.
Am I right to understand that it's the first 3, isn't it, that are drawn in effect from the heritage topic paper, and I think you say that deals with that greenbelt purpose. Is that right?
Yes.
And then the other boxes as we go along, so criterion for urban sprawl, is that more directly related to the greenbelt purpose and criterion 5 as well?
Yeah, so we see at page 76 that we've got purpose 1. So we deal with the 3 characteristics as the first 3 criterion under purpose 4, given that I guess it's sort of been widely agreed that purpose 4 was the most important for York, and then we deal with purpose 1, and there's a box on that. There's just 1 criterion, the urban sprawl box, as you've picked up, and then similarly purpose 3, which is on page 78, and then on page 79, there's just checking I've got my right page number, yes, 79, there's then the box on criterion 5 covering encroachment. So there's a consistent approach to these. And as well, what we sought to address in these tables, and I can take any of those, there's sort of questions raised about what's the evidence-based considerations, what have you, as well as the sort of site visits and desktop work, you know, what's the key information that's been taken into account. So there's a box there setting out the relevant assessment evidence, and really by sort of linking that with the assessment questions, we've sought to be clear about, well, what's the evidence we've used, and then what have we asked around it, how have we interrogated it, the detailed assessments questions sort of answer that question as to key things we've looked for from those evidence sources, as well as key things we've looked for in undertaking site visits and desktop analysis work of that evidence work.
Okay, so just to be clear, under purpose 4 we have criteria 1, 2 and 3. Then under purpose 1 we've got criterion 4, and under purpose 3 we've got criterion 5. The numbers don't necessarily match up with purposes,
No,
but that's the structure.
Maybe a slightly better numbering system might help there, but yes, that is, that's it.
Yeah, that's fine, I understand that.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. And after going through the criteria, the last part of Section 8 deals with the question of permanence, again by reference to the MPPF requirement to define boundaries clearly using physical features readily recognisable and likely to be permanent. Again,
apologies, yeah, just before we come on to that, so the criteria, under each of the criteria you have a number of different questions, and you list there the sources of evidence that you've drawn on, I think, to answer the questions that you've posed. Were you, Mr. Wood, tasked with going out and walking the Greenbelt boundary with this set of questions and to answer it for each section?
I wasn't actually myself, but there was clearly a team of people in terms of looking at the boundaries and making sure on the ground that really the purpose of this methodology was to make sure that it was done in a consistent way.
So as well as the sources of evidence listed, it's also informed by going there?
Yes. In most cases, yes. What I'm making the point is maybe not, I wouldn't claim that absolutely every centimetre will have been walked. There will have been points where views will have been taken or issues will have been looked at, but the boundaries have been looked at by the team in drawing up the annexes.
Yes, sir. Obviously, there was desktop evidence that you can see, but site visits were carried out. We can provide further detail on that in due course, but as I understand it, there were site visits carried out as a minimum where a planning application or other development was proposed on the boundary, where the urban edge may have been unclear from the desktop survey, or where representations had been specifically made relating to the boundary from parties including Historic England. And there were further site visits carried on to review specifically contentious sections of the boundary. This hasn't proceeded on the basis of a pure desktop exercise. There's been extensive fieldwork to accompany that. Thank you. Mr. Wood, is there anything more you want to say about the boundary definition in that section?
No, just again, the purpose of that section was to provide that consistency of approach to recognising that different members of the team would be involved in this exercise and different areas we'll be looking at. So again, from a point of consistency, being absolutely clear about what the approach was. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I've identified the annexes that result from the methodology. Mr. Wood, is there anything more you want to say about the annexes, or is that really a matter of looking through detailed boundary sessions later on?
I think, to me, that's a matter for those sessions, but I guess in terms of looking at these tables and the interplay between the detailed assessment questionnaires and the evidence, and what does the evidence tell us, and where exactly has it been used, then we need to look in the annexes as we work through those to see the actual application of this methodology.
Subject to that, can we just pick up the question that was raised under 7.1b, the role of heritage assets and other environmental designations. Now, those of us who were here a couple of years ago remember the debate, more than a couple of years ago, remember the debate about how individual heritage assets, such as listed buildings, scheduled monuments, along with nature conservation designations, SSIs, and so on, were used as part of the methodology. And in short order, the criticism was that they didn't necessarily relate to the Greenbelt purposes, including the aspect of Purpose 4, which specifically related to York and the historic character and setting of the city. Can you just cover that point, please, Mr. Wood, and just explain what has been done and how any references to, for example, information about listed buildings and other heritage assets as part of the baseline evidence need to be viewed when you look at the methodology?
Thank you. I think I'd start with saying it wasn't clear. Clearly it was pointed out to us that it wasn't clear, and going back through it, clearly we've sought to address that, and I'd sort of, I guess, on a lot of these issues refer back to the Table 5 in Section 11 of the addendum, where we've really sought to recognise our understanding that things weren't clear. But I guess in terms of the answer to the actual question that's being posed, two things I would say is one, that heritage assets, that this methodology is not being used. One allegation has been made that it's there to protect heritage assets and their setting. That is not the case. There's no part of the methodology that seeks to do that. And then what we've been particularly keen to sort of tidy up and be clear on is that really sort of heritage assets and these factors, they're part of a much wider evidence base, and really they're informative, they're evidence-based that are taken into account. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but they've not been determinative of Greenbelt boundaries. When you look through the annexes, there are reference in places to heritage assets, but again, in terms of trying to keep it simple, it's been sort of understanding, for example, an issue if there's a heritage asset, and it might be a conservation area or a listed building, openness may well be an important characteristic or feature of that heritage asset. And in some cases that's sort of been picked up on. Yes, there's an openness characteristic here that's important to pick up on, but sometimes a heritage asset such a conservation area was sort of picked up on, and sort of analysis was, well, actually, you know, openness isn't important to this heritage asset, so it's not really a sort of consideration. So it's trying to really give you a pointer as information about openness, and also given that we're dealing with historic character and setting and special qualities, it's also an indicator that, you know, in terms of the sort of historic character of that locality. So that's really been sort of the way that they've been bits of information that have been taken into account, but they have not determined a boundary.
So just to be clear, insofar as Purpose 4 relates to protecting the historic character and setting of York, does reference to an individual asset mean you're looking to protect the asset, or take that information into account as part of the broader assessment of the historic character and setting of the city?
The latter.
Okay. And the other environmental designations, what's position in relation to those?
It's similar really, in terms of, again, it was accepted that where there were references, for example, to nature conservation, other environmental designations, it wasn't clear really. I could probably hopefully be slightly briefer. Again, they're one source of evidence for considering openness. It's sort of recognised, and I think you know, that we've highlighted that those designations, those types of areas can equally be found within an urban area as they can outside of an urban area, but quite often sort of nature conservation sites, green infrastructure corridors, there is a link there with countryside, and often they are part of, or sort of give you an idea about the sort of character, role and function of the countryside. So again, in terms of trying to understand, you know, the sort of issues around the countryside, they've informed that, but again, they have not been a determining factor as to where the detailed boundary was set.
I think that two examples we gave in our letter were about flood risk and air quality, and we questioned what relevance that was to the setting of the Greenbelt. How has that played out in the new method?
Hopefully you won't see references to those points in the document, because clearly we've recognised that the factors that we need to set out need to be relevant to openness. Factors such as air quality and flood risk are clearly pertinent to the overall spatial strategy, but we've sought to be much tighter in identifying those factors and elements of the evidence base that are applicable to the Greenbelt and openness.
So you've re-looked at those areas, have you, where, for example, those issues were at play?
Well, all areas have been re-looked at. Clearly there's a concern being raised about the time that it's taken to do this exercise. Clearly what we've done through the annexes is reworked using the detail, using the criteria, the key question, the detailed question, the evidence-based sources. We've worked through those annexes to make sure that that assessment is tightly based around the actual methodology. So those other factors will have been looked at, or well, not looked at, but will be considered, or they will not have been considered because it's been considered in a different way.
Yes, sir. I mean, obviously, the point that was raised that there was a conflation between those factors and greenbelt purposes and the criteria that are set out in the methodology. Hopefully, make it clear through the key questions as well as the detailed assessment questions that those factors are not being relied upon as far as the application of the greenbelt purposes is concerned.
We've really sought to really be very clear that the spatial shapers are a matter of, they are shapers of the overall local plan spatial strategy, but what there is commonality of issues and commonality of evidence between the greenbelt methodology and the wider plan-making process.
Okay, now the next questions, D and E, are about the need to promote sustainable patterns of development, channeling development towards urban areas or locations beyond the boundary, which I think you've covered already. Question 7.1F is about consistency of the proposed boundaries with the local plan strategy. Again, can you just explain how that's been taken into account as part of the methodology, please?
Yeah, so we've got that summarised at the end of section 8 of the addendum, but I guess we go back to really what are the fundamental things that we're trying to achieve, and both in terms of the Greenbelt methodology approach as reflected by the strategic principles and in the local plan spatial strategy and the spatial strategy policies of the plan, is seeing this fundamental emphasis on protecting York's historic character and setting and its special quality. So almost that sort of starting point sort of links the two together in terms of that consistency. I think this is where we've drawn out the strategic principles and set them out to be much clearer about that link at that early stage of the boundary setting methodology as to how the sort of links in with the strategy. And then, as I sort of described in setting out the methodology, with the Greenbelt paper is reflected on the local plan's approach and its evidence base in terms of understanding development needs, my wrongful use of the term shortfall, but that difference between what can be accommodated within the urban area, what can be channeled into that urban area, and really sort of establishing so that the methodology was satisfied in itself that those needs could be met without releasing land from the general extent of the Greenbelt.
Okay, now just drawing that together, please, Mr. Woods, can we just deal with one of the other questions that was posed by the inspector? Perhaps I can just take these, take two together actually. First one, do the boundaries include land which is unnecessary to keep permanently open? And more broadly, can you summarise your position on whether the approach you've taken is consistent with national policy, please?
Yeah, I guess in terms of 7.2, my too short an answer would be no. The proposed boundaries do not, as a matter of principle, include any land which is unnecessary to keep permanently open. And the reason I would say that is because, as sort of done through the methodology and through the annexes, land that's included in the Greenbelt has been assessed as meeting one or more of the identified purposes of Greenbelt. So that sort of tightening up of the approach to make sure things that were expressly linked to Greenbelt addresses that point. In terms of the sort of the issue, I guess looking at question 7.2 in terms of clarity, justification and sort of effectiveness, the links with national policy. I guess in terms of providing clarity, we've clearly a key driver in that and a key factor has been responding to your concerns that you raised, the inspector's concerns, to provide clarity in terms of a better explanation of how the evidence base, what is the evidence base and how is it being applied, and really sort of clarity in terms of that going back to that sort of strategic local assessment criteria in terms of that sort of stage 4 of the methodology that I've outlined. It reflects, importantly, national, but I think as well what it seeks to do and what it does do and what we set out particularly as reflected by the strategic principles, is to reflect national, regional and local policy requirements, so that all those factors are taken into account and there's alignment there. It's resulted in detailed inner and outer boundaries being proposed, and the need for that is to ensure that the setting and special character of York is safeguarded. So that's, I guess, the sort of fundamental justification of those boundaries. Touched on earlier that the duty to cooperate based discussions that were held with neighbouring authorities. So we've made sure that the methodology and the approach is based on effective joint working on cross-boundary priorities, and there's a statement of common ground, EX-SOCG2, which picks up on those broader discussions with neighbouring authorities. I guess so another question is particularly around the consistency with national policy in terms of consistency with the NPPF. The boundary setting methodology does reflect the fundamental aim and purposes of the NPPF, and this is drawn out through the strategic principles again, so that we can give more clarity on that link. The proposed boundaries are capable of enduring beyond the planned period, so addressing paragraph 83. The methodology is clear on developing criteria which are drawn from and linked to the NPPF. We touched on earlier the approach around using readily recognisable and permanent features, so in terms of that aspect of the NPPF, and also the character of villages and whether the village makes an important contribution to openness of the green belt is also addressed at stage 2 of the methodology. So overall, I think our position is that this is much clearer, the addendum, in terms of setting out that it is justified and does align and deliver national policy as well as, importantly, regional policy.
Just while we're on the question of national policy, in section 9, and this is page 89, if that helps, you talk about offsetting through compensatory improvements to the environmental quality and accessibility of remaining greenbelt land. What's that about?
Sorry, just point me to the section again, please. Thank you. So in terms of the issue of, I guess, seeking enhancements to greenbelt land, what we've set out is that through the spatial strategy of the local plan, there are the policies for each of the strategic sites, and all of those need to deliver significantly enhanced public access. So it's really what this partner, and it's really done through the annexes, seeking to work through to really look for, identify opportunities for enhanced access or compensatory measures to sort of improve the quality, given that their land is being removed from the greenbelt, and looking really through those site criteria to really try and improve accessibility where it's possible, given that the strategic sites are coming forward within the previous general extent of the greenbelt. So it's really trying to make that connection to those strategic sites and developments that come forward.
Yeah, I was wondering if there was anything in national policy that lends legitimacy to that approach. Or whether it's just something that you say is reasonable.
Well, it's something that's set out, it ties into the approach of the local plan that we propose as being.
So I think the position would be that something that the council is proposing is consistent with the overall objectives of Greenbelt policy.
I think as well, my colleagues just have it. I think we're perhaps picking up as well. I appreciate that we're being assessed in terms of 2012 MPPF. I think we're just picking up paragraph 142 of the most recent MPPF. Clearly, we've been bound by the current by the 2012 MPPF, but mindful of Greenbelt considerations set out in later national guidance.
Because I've been consistently trying to put it from my mind, I don't have the up-to-date MPPF in front of me. So I'm sure everyone else has done the same. So if you could just remind us what paragraph 142 of the... Oh, thank you. If you could just remind us what it says, or the relevant part of it, perhaps.
Yes, where is this, sir?
I think we just go for, it's quite a long paragraph. The last sentence is, they should also set out ways in which the impact of removing land from the Greenbelt can be offset through compensatory improvements to the environmental quality and accessibility of remaining Greenbelt land.
Yes, well, I thought that's where it had come from.
Yes.
But clearly we're examining this plan under the 2012 NPPF, which, unless I've missed something for quite a long time, doesn't include that wording, does it? So I wonder what you wanted to say about that.
I think the position would be, well, first of all, we'd hope to secure that under a separate policy which could be debated in due course through the examination. Secondly, though, I think we'd say that although it's not strictly within the confines of the 2012 MPPF, that policy approach is consistent overall with the objectives of Greenbelt policy as set out in the 2012 version. So although paragraph 142 does not appear within the 2012 framework, the overall policy objectives are consistent with the aspirations of the 2012 policy. I think as well we can say that it's consistent with broad principles of sustainable development to make such provision, quite apart from being consistent with purposes of Greenbelt policy.
I'm wondering really, even though it's sort of headed offsetting through compensatory improvements, I wonder, is it right to say that actually the approach that you're taking here is simply seeking to minimise harm?
So I think it's fair that there's an element of that. The wording is, as you've identified, probably drawn from the later MPPF. But if one looks at what the fundamentals, what the policy is trying to do, a part of it would be seeking to achieve that. A part of it would also be seeking to achieve principles relating to placemaking at allocations, creation of mixed communities, the quality of those communities, so there'd be broader sustainability principles in play as well. We take the point that the heading may not identify entirely accurately what that policy objective is seeking to achieve.
Because the way that I read that, it seems to imply, at least imply, that the council is accepting some sort of compensation for the harm that would be caused to the Greenbelt, whereas in fact I think you're saying, well, actually it's about minimising harm, but in addition to that, setting out requirements that you otherwise would for good planning reasons, if I can use that sort of shorthand.
That's a fair summary, sir, yes. Thank you, sir. If that's acceptable so far, what I was going to ask Mr. Wood to do is just to pick up a few of the main themes in the representations and hearing statements that have been made thus far. The first one, Mr. Wood, can I take up a point about what has been done at a strategic level? Now, obviously, taking the concerns that have been expressed previously by the inspectors, what was figure 7 in the old methodology in the previous addendum is not now relied upon. Instead, we've got the strategic principles and scoping that has been identified in your summary, and there's an allegation that effectively the new methodology doesn't provide any proper strategic context for the boundary setting. Can you just explain your position on that, please?
Yeah, that summary is helpful and correct in terms of the figure not now being included. As I think I've hopefully tried to cover already, we've been trying to establish a much clearer strategic context.
Apologies. Can you just remind me which was figure 7?
So that was the figure in the earlier addendum, EXCYC 18, which identified areas of land that had to be kept open by layering over areas of nature conservation space, amongst other things, if you recall. Thank you, sir.
I think that just helpfully tie back to some of the previous answers in terms of being much clearer about the role and impact of such things as nature conservation areas, for example. I think some of these diagrams did not help in that respect. But in terms of the sort of question being posed, there is a clear strategic context for boundary setting. I think it's important as well to highlight that, particularly in the case of York, that a strategic overview has already been taken by the regional spatial strategy. So the starting point that we have in terms of that general extent and the policies of the RSS that give you a form of strategic starting point, and a very important part of that. I'm probably repeating a little bit of what I said earlier, really around the strategic principles, but they provide the strategic context for this exercise by drawing on the RSS, drawing on the MPPF, drawing on the 5 purposes, drawing on the Green Belt appraisal and the heritage topic paper. That is the strategic context. And I think what we've been careful to do is not to have diagrams early on in the document that in effect went beyond what they were capable and should have done at that point in the document. They have been removed because they were not relevant and were at the wrong place, really. So we've really tried to build this up as a methodology. So that's why we've taken the approach of having the 13 principles, which hopefully we've then explained, then get developed. So from the Council's perspective, there's a clear strategic context set in the methodology.
Another point is that, well, the detailed assessment questions that we've looked at under the different criteria don't have very much in common with the local assessment criteria that might have been used at a previous stage. Again, any issue there in your view?
No, an issue. I guess a couple of points. One is if we'd have continued with the local assessment criteria, given that they were pinpointed as a particular issue and by the inspectors, I think just without even going any further than that, would have not been a positive step forward. So we sort of got the sort of need to make that clearer. They were not understood by the inspectors and others at that time. So we needed to do something about that. I think importantly, it's the same evidence that's been considered. That's a really sort of fundamental point about this addendum and the previous one. The evidence-based studies and the information, it's the same information that has been looked at, but we just really tried to be much more clear about what does this evidence tell us, what's its implications, and then how have we gone away and used it. So yes, they are different, but we were asked to make sure that we were simple and clear. And our view and the approach that we've taken is that by having the key question and the detailed assessment questions, that they are much clearer than the local assessment criteria were, and they are expressly linked to Greenbelt's purposes, and as touched on earlier, they address the previous concerns that were raised. So yes, they're different, but we were asked to produce something in effect better, simpler and clearer. And in our view, that's what we produced.
Okay. I think we've already touched upon this, but the next point I just want to confirm is that notwithstanding the new methodology, there's a number of the hearing statements raised concerns about the approach that's been taken to historic or heritage assets and the methodology, still including references, for example, to landmark monuments. Just explain, possibly with reference to the landmark monuments specifically, how historic or heritage assets have been taken into account, and whether you accept any criticism that there's still a degree of inappropriate use of individual assets as part of a methodology that's directed at purpose 4.
I think we did touch on this earlier. We've been very clear, particularly through the detailed assessment questions and the actual approach taken, and the wording of those questions, to make sure that all of that, all the heritage assets were taken into account in the right way, as this, probably repeating what I said earlier, but in terms of this context and information, that there's something that are taken into account. So again, refuting that they're not there to, this methodology is not seeking to protect them. I appreciate I'm repeating a point made earlier, but they are about that evidence and context. Where we do sort of see, I guess the issue of landmark monuments is that where this is sort of drawing on the heritage topic paper, we draw this out under criterion. Two, just looking for my page reference in the addendum. So we've got the explanation of in terms of applying purpose 4 to York. Really the important role of landmark buildings and monuments within the city, and then really working through how those views and those different considerations within a York context are then to be taken into account through the actual assessment work. So that's set out at pages 73 and 74. So there's a very specific consideration there as part of the methodology. But on the broader point, the really heritage assets and such information has helped the council to understand the context and value of the land being considered.
Thank you. Another theme relates to the role of countryside in the methodology. Can you just explain to the inspectors how that purpose has been taken into account, please? Purpose 3, I should say, assisting in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment.
Yeah, so we've got in the, just drawing on the addendum, pages 78 and 79, in terms of hopefully familiar format now in terms of how each purpose has been dealt with, and then the table that deals with criterion 5 on encroachments. Really, what we've tried to do here is particularly focus on the detailed questions here, to sort of really understanding the characteristics, the role and function of the land, to make sure as the questions go through, I guess we'll focus here on the detailed assessment questions 5.1, 5.2 and 5.3. So in terms of understanding whether the land does have the characteristics of countryside and therefore needs to be protected from encroachment, by working through those detailed questions about the absence of built development or urbanising influences, about the function of the countryside in terms of its relationship, the uses within it, and also the character in terms of openness, views and accessibility. So these are the sort of functional and character considerations that have been taken into account. And to link back to the earlier point about nature conservation sites, green infrastructure, corridors, repeating the point again that these do sometimes have connections and sometimes are in the countryside, so they may have informed such considerations, but again have